Very good morning to everyone. Thank you again for coming in early on a Sunday morning. Apologies for the delay. We'll just get started quickly. Our first session for today is on open education. Um, so there's a quote that goes, "An educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as free people." This is sometimes attributed to the great uncle of one of the persons who was here yesterday, Thomas Jefferson. And I say sometimes attributed because, like many things that are on the internet now, it's not very well cited. This is probably one of the problems that we run into when we're talking about open education as well, about the quality of work. So I thought that would be an apt quote to start with. Is the volume okay? Can you hear me at the back? Okay, thanks. So talking about education is always an interesting topic because I don't think we as a people have figured out what education really is or should be, what it means. We know that education is important enough that politicians, for example, decide that they need degrees from certain places even if they haven't been there. Um, but we still haven't quite figured out, what type of education we should probably is probably ideal, or what education means. And open education is something that, this is a personal thought, I don't know if it's necessarily true, but I think the process of open education is something that could help us get a better understanding of what direction we should go in with this. And when I'm saying we don't quite know what it is, I think this is a good thing, because if we think we know what defines education, that of course becomes a limiting factor for it, and that's never a good thing with education. So what is open education? I was looking around for a good definition, and incidentally, I found a very succinct definition on Wikipedia. So I'm just going to go with that. And this is a bit ironical because, Wikipedia, open education, so. Exactly. So I'm just going to read out the definition. It's a collective term to describe the institutional practices and programmatic initiatives that broaden access to learning and training that are traditionally offered through formal education systems. The qualifier of open before education, it refers to the elimination of barriers that can preclude both opportunities and recognition for participation in institution-based learning. So while this does kind of describe open education, there are a few phrases there which are worth thinking about. Participation in institution-based learning. When you look at the MOOCs and the open coursewares, they are kind of institution-based learning, but they're also kind of outside of that paradigm. When you're talking about elimination of barriers, are we talking about just, let's say, financial barriers, and maybe open access kind of gets to that? Or are we also talking about things like the Copyright Amendment, which allows visually disabled persons with visual disability to access educational works or any scientific works or any works? So there are a few terms in that definition which we could look over and kind of try to think through. Some of the things that fall under open education are open educational resources, of course, which are the things that most people are now aware of, including open courseware, your Coursera, EduX, and all of those things. But aside from open educational resources, there are also open technologies that facilitate collaboration, flexible learning and systems, and open sharing of teaching practices that help educators in their work as well. It also touches upon new approaches to assessment and accreditation and collaborative learning. There are many barriers to this as well, of course, and I'll let our participants touch upon that in their respective talks.
Some reputation for, and that information then in the trademark captures. And of course, trademarks then can get abused and used in other ways, but that's one way you can understand trademark within this system I'm giving for you. And so information to a certain extent has to be proprietary, but information also has to recognize the limits, and this is where we need to think about this balance of intellectual property very seriously. Data-free, information proprietary, but only up to a certain extent. It's when we get to knowledge, and this is where I'll end my comments, even though time has been up for a while. Knowledge, we get into some very interesting questions regarding the proprietary nature. Because much of knowledge is protected through social and cultural forms of exclusion, which might work in tandem with intellectual property in many pernicious ways. And we need to be very careful about intellectual property being used in that particular way. But we must also think about cultural reforms and social reforms and political reforms that go hand in hand with any intellectual property reforms, so that knowledge itself does not become too proprietary. And as I promised, there are 4 epistemological categories. I've talked about data, information, and knowledge. And the 4th one is wisdom. And I don't think that can be taught by anybody. But I hope that we do have the wisdom to understand the proper balance between intellectual property rights and the need for access for the various types of data, information, and knowledge that I've discussed. So thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. Our final speaker for the panel is Professor Dev Ganji. He's flown in from Oxford just for the weekend, and he's out again tomorrow. So thank you for the quick visit. He joined Oxford in 2013, and I think relevant to a lot of the students here is that he's joined Bentley and Sherman as the IP textbook as a co-author from the next edition. So that might be useful.
Before I started speaking, now I'm going to have to earn the applause. Let me begin with the thank yous while the slides are loading up. I'd like to say a very sincere thank you to the MHRD chair for sponsoring this, but also to Professor Bashir. Now, I know Shamnath for 21 years, so it sounds a little odd to be saying Professor Bashir, but he's used his chairs as a leverage to get IP issues visible and do things, which has been pretty fantastic. So my sincere thank you to him, to the Law and Technology Society students for the very early mornings, the very late nights, and having to wear suits in this weather. So a lot of work has gone into this, so thank you. And thank you to Spicy IP as well. I'm a reader. I benefit hugely from it. It took me by surprise to hear that there's been a 11-year sort of anniversary. That 11-year anniversary was quite interesting. I've been married for a while, and if I try and say, oh, I've forgotten the 10th year anniversary, but we'll celebrate it in the 11th year, that's not going to go down really well. So you can do that with some things, but not with others. So, but sincere gratitude to a lot of people who've made this possible. Thank you. So let's just make a start. I'd like to begin by saying I'm not here really as an IP academic. I'm here as a journal editor. I'm a journal editor on the Modern Law Review, which some of you may have heard of. I'm also beginning to put, as part of a team, beginning to put together a new journal. There's a group of us, including quite a few former NLS students, Indian law students who are now based abroad, based here in Bangalore. We're putting together something which is loosely called the Indian Law Review. We've been negotiating with publishers. So it's very much as someone involved with the operation and running of journals that I'm here to speak about some of the things that have struck me as strange or puzzling or difficult. I'm really here to talk about a transition to open access journals. We're looking at something which is moving. It's definitely heading in the direction of open access. I'm just looking at the road, the speed bumps, the potholes, how long it's going to take us to get there, and how easily we can get there. So that's really the gist of my talk. So these are the 4 topics I'm going to cover. What is open access? The distribution mechanics of open access. How is it actually gotten out? And there are 2 broad routes, green and gold, and I'll speak about that. How copyright fits into the picture. Part of the theme of this conference is working with and working around IP. So I'll be looking at copyright and trying to look at sustainable business models. We do live in a world where by now we know that if you give something away for free, you can still develop an economy, a revenue stream, and some kind of a business model around it. So just looking at how that actually works. So what is open access? Very simple, intuitive definition. Open access literature is adigital. So it's intangible, it's electronic, it's freed from the material world, it's online.
Controversial that having cheaper books from a company like Wiley in a country like India does put pressure on not developing indigenous publishing models. That may be a little bit controversial because everybody wants something that's cheap, right? This is the gratis version of this. But at the same time, there is something predatory about that discriminatory practice that I don't think has gotten enough attention. And the type of lawsuits you're describing may be part of that process as well.
I was going to comment along the same lines that the alternative is lacking. We don't have a good open access. We don't have many good open access journals to switch to, or publishers. I think Shamnad wanted to comment.
So great, very, very thought-provoking presentations. Thank you. Thank you very much. But just two questions perhaps related. One is, the whole business of inclusive open access, which is one of the things that I raised earlier. And how does this entire debate pan out? I mean, it pans out very well for those of us, with our laptops, and we can access all the latest course offerings and all that. We've got about 30 law schools in the country. We put some things online and students can access it. But 800 odd law schools, perhaps many of them teaching law in the vernacular, right? To whatever extent they can. No computers, no data access. How do we go about, what does open access mean to them? One, how exactly do we define open access if you're serious about access, and how do we take it down there? And people spoke about the revolution that the Khan Academy videos did for education, and I saw a very interesting proposal from two IIT folks saying that Khan Academy doesn't make sense to rural India, and if I have to take it there, I need to, one, translate it, and I think the Khan Academy itself is now in a translation mode, and two is I need to actually download all this data. I can't get them to access it on high bandwidth. I need them to download it and then hopefully use the mobile revolution, which has touched greater parts of rural India than internet access and other things. But through the smartphone, farmers are beginning to access more of online data. But if you can download it and get it into CDs and then distribute it across schools. So there's actually a program where they actually downloaded everything off the Khan Academy and then translated it and then distributed it across schools. So that's one way they increase access. So it's fostering a little more inclusiveness within the open access paradigm. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that or any interesting models that you came across in your own experience, because several of you are tried in your own capacities to foster open access in different ways. And the second question I had was, although I'm a great proponent of the fact that we need to encourage as much as open access, specifically for educational content, because we're going to generate that out of publicly funded institutions anyway. And I was a great advocate of that till the time that I found that it's very difficult working with Indian institutions. After my own experience, I said I'm never going to be a fully salaried academic employee of an institution anymore. So because there's way too much control over you, and there's tremendous bureaucracy, and I think it kills the ability to run a variety of programs in the way that you want to, or experiment. And so for people like me, I'm wondering, I mean, if I wanted to make a living, right, outside of this setup and not earn a regular salary, then, how am I really going to benefit from an open access model, create the content that I want, and yet, so would I necessarily have to go in for a model where I sell my content, or could I employ some interesting, what is the example that you use? Yes, Tom Sawyer kind of examples, methodology or models where I still release it open access, but I find very creative ways in which I can monetize the content. For a developing country like India, obviously, and they've presented some very, very interesting framework and in terms of how, authors having to pay to publish their articles in open access, that's not going to work very well here, right? And here, I don't think we've even understood what if the government doesn't understand what the philosophy of open access is. And Yogesh was part of a project. What was it called? E-Pathshala, right? Glorious term. And a lot of us created content for that. And I was shocked to see the contract that came from the ministry. And the contract said, well, we'll pay you, I had to write an entire chapter. And they paid what, 1,500 rupees? And then they said, the copyright belongs to us. And I said, why do you want the copyright with you? I'll give you a license. And unfortunately, Yogesh tried hard, but he said, well, this